there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today's episode comes from the EFL Teacher Journeys Conference held in Hiroshima, Japan last weekend. For today's episode, we'll provide a series of mini-interviews conducted at the conference with some of the presenters, including the featured speaker, David Paul, the conference coordinator, Mike Ellis, former guest of the show, Richard Pinter, as well as both Rob and I talking about our own presentations there. So to begin today's episode, here's Mike Ellis talking about the background of the conference.
So this is the 5th annual EFL Teacher Journeys Conference. We hold it every year in June, and the venue shifts around Japan. It's my 4th year working on it as co-chair, and the basic kind of philosophy of this conference is our narrative inquiry into our personal and professional development as teachers. So there's one story that I've started the past 2 conferences with that I guess I should share here as well. So there was one student who came back to our high school after recently graduating, and this happens a lot. You know, after they go to university, they often want to just come back and reminisce or talk to their teachers, see what they're up to, and it can be a bit of an awkward time because we're always so busy with the new first years and getting things started. But I always try to make at least a minute or 2 to sit down with them and talk about how their classes are going and how they feel that our English classes prepared them. Usually they don't give very specific feedback. I mean, these are students that I might have only taught 1 year, 3 years earlier. But one student who came this particular spring, I had taught for 3 years in a row. She was so motivated. She, took every English class she could, and we had a really close relationship. I thought she understood kind of my teaching philosophy. So I decided to ask her this question, what was useful for you? And she thought about it for a while. I was thinking, okay, is she going to talk about the extensive reading program? Is she going to talk about, our kind of intensive discussion about academic writing and things like that? But she just said, "You were so funny." And my first reaction was just pure shock, because as teachers in teacher training programs, we're always taught to kind of put ourselves on the side. These classes should be student-centered, and that makes a lot of sense, because as teachers, our success should be measured in how much students learn. But I think we tend to forget that from the student's perspective, the teacher really is a large part of the classroom. They, notice things about you, and therefore my second reaction after the initial shock was just kind of sympathy, because I realized it was consistent with my own experience as a high school student. I don't remember as much of my classes as I do about my teachers. And that's the purpose of this conference. It's, once a year, just to turn the spotlight around from the students or the tasks and look at our own personal journeys as teachers and learn from each other so that we can then better serve our students.
I sat down with David Paul from the Language Teaching Professionals Organisation, an author of books such as Finding Out, a best-selling EFL children's textbook. I asked David about his experiences of setting up his own English school in Japan in the 1980s.
I'm David Paul, and I live in Hiroshima, and I used to have a lot of schools, David English House. They closed about 5 years ago, and now I run Language Teaching Professionals.
Okay, and you set up your David's English House in, was it 1982?
Originally, yes.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the process of setting up your own school?
Well, in those days it was really difficult because the visa laws were a lot stricter. but I'd got fired from my previous job and was a bit in limbo, and I thought it'd be nice to set up my own school, and I got permission actually because although I got rejected by the immigration office a few times, a lot of friends or students went to the immigration office sort of one by one and said, please could you help me, kind of thing. And in the end the immigration office sort of conceded a bit and said, okay, well, they gave me a sort of impossible target. If you can get this number of students by this amount of time, then we'll let you keep going. And I exceeded that target, and it went from there, really. There are lots of barriers at the beginning, like I wasn't allowed to employ anybody, but then how can you grow if you can't employ anybody? There was a kind of catch-22. You had to have a turnover of X sort of million yen before you could employ anybody, but you couldn't get that kind of turnover until you employed anybody. so it was sort of impossible. But again, just by luck, I got around that because I found a person who had a family in Japan, and the immigration office kept on saying to him, you've got to find a job to support your family. So so it was a sort of there were ways around it, but it was difficult at first. But once you got going, it wasn't things were a lot easier.
You talked about the importance of a game of shogi. Could you explain that? Well, first maybe explain what shogi is, and then what that situation was.
Yeah, okay. I needed to get started. I needed legal advice, and so I went to a Japanese lawyer and for help, and he brought his friend along, who was a sort of quite influential person in the community, and who had previously tried to open a school and failed, and so he was kind of suspicious about how could I open a school when he couldn't, kind of thing, and because I hadn't been in Japan long, how could I possibly start something like that in Japan without really knowing Japanese culture? So he asked me, can you tell me one Japanese thing I can do? And I said, well, I can play shogi, which is Japanese chess. And so in this kind of serious meeting, what I thought was going to be a serious meeting, he basically said to the lawyer, do you have a shogi board? And he did. So on this, instead of discussing all my rational plans, we played shogi, and I beat him. And he, from that moment on, he was kind of adjusting to the fact that perhaps a foreigner could do something Japanese, and from that was the kind of turning point. They said, okay, what can we do for you, basically? And I haven't played shogi for I don't know how many years, but at that time I had friends who played, and so I picked it up. Yeah.
Right. And so now you're very involved with ETJ.
Yes, yeah.
English teacher in Japan. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, English teachers in Japan started in about 1999, 2000, around that time. I originally started it because I felt there was lots and lots of teachers who weren't joining existing associations at that time. In fact, the vast majority of teachers weren't. People were just getting on with their daily job teaching and then enjoying themselves at the weekend, kind of thing, as most people do, and didn't see, there was obviously a lot of very dedicated teachers, or teachers who were very aware of professional development, especially university teachers who were joining associations, but then there was lots of other teachers who weren't, and so I felt that it would be good to come up with a different concept of an association which would bring those teachers into the kind of a world with more professional development.
Right.
And so that's so I came up with an idea, and it worked. And ETJ, is really ETJ is aimed at. It's changed a lot over the years, and there's lots of teachers at different stages of professional development within ETJ, but it's primarily aimed at the busy classroom teacher who's only got a limited amount of time to attend things or get involved in things, and that's one of the reasons it's free. It's a free association. A big reason for that is that it's easy to join, and then once a teacher joins, they may become interested in something that ECJ is doing, but it's easy to cross the threshold,
right.
And that concept works. It's sort of like I look at it as a sort of hotmail of teachers' associations, and it works pretty much along the same kind of lines. It's like, once you're in, then somebody might think, I might be interested in that discussion group, I might be interested in that event, kind of thing. So and of course, because it's a free association, it has many members, and it has currently about 10,000 members, but obviously with varying degrees of involvement in ECJ. But that's the way it should be, really. Right. Everybody, it's not. It's very loose, but I think that there's an important place for that in the teaching community in Japan.
Right. So you said that in the past, when you were setting up your school, it was kind of quite difficult. There were lots of barriers in place. What do you think? Do you think it's any easier for people if they want to set up their schools now?
It's much easier, largely because the visa laws were changed,
right.
And it fundamentally changed in around 1998. The law, so it was possible to be independent.
Right.
Whereas until that time, you really had to get sponsorship from somebody else. You had to, basically, you weren't free to do a lot of things. And the Immigration Office wasn't supportive anyway of initiatives. That wasn't what they were focusing on. But the attitude has changed a lot these days. Of course, it's not easy, but by comparison, it's much easier.
Right.
And so there's the number of independent teachers and independent school owners has just snowballed since 1998, and now it's quite normal to be an independent teacher or to teach at home or teach in your neighborhood. Whereas before then, almost all the local self-employed teachers or teachers teaching in the small schools were Japanese. And now, these days, a very large percentage are not Japanese. Right. People married to somebody Japanese, perhaps, but also, but not necessarily.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. That's great.
And here's Richard Pinter reflecting on how his presentation went.
So, hi Richard.
Hi, Matt.
So you gave your talk about an hour ago.
Yes.
Maybe just for our listeners, can you describe what you talked about and how you feel it went?
Okay, shall I describe what I'm wearing as well? So,
yeah, sure.
I'm wearing a black shirt. It was, the talk went really well, actually. Mainly, I rushed through everything I wanted to say. My talk is called an extra lumbar, which is a bone in your back, and I hurt my back and found out that I had this extra bone, and I used that to kind of create a reflection on a kind of critical incident. And then I kind of tried to just tell the story really quickly in about 20 minutes. And then I just sat down and talked to everyone about their own experiences of how their kind of personal life has influenced their professional life.
Yeah, that was your main point. There was a synergy between your motivation and your students' motivation.
Right, exactly. That's kind of the focus of my PhD research, actually. And so I wanted to get other teachers' experiences where they felt that they'd been highly motivated, and that had then fed into the students' motivation, or vice versa, when they'd been had a low motivation. And my story, the backstory, kind of is really zeroing in on a moment where I had very low motivation, very high motivation, very low motivation again, and how that was kind of mirrored by the students' responses.
Were you hoping that your backstory reference got more of a laugh? Because I found it really funny, but no one else laughed.
Yeah, usually, this is maybe a bit sad, but usually when I'm giving a talk, I'll design a few jokes into what I'm going to say. Like, actually, as I'm practicing the talk, I'll think of a joke and write it down even. But I didn't plan any jokes for this one, and I think it came across. It wasn't as funny. It wasn't like as I didn't get as many laughs as usual, but never mind. It was a small group. I think there was only 7 or 8 people watching.
And after you finished your talk, which I think lasted about 25 minutes or so, you then got our feedback and we had a discussion. And what did you take from that discussion?
Lots of great. This is the thing that I love about this Teacher Journeys Conference is those discussions. So you're given 45 minutes per slot. So even though you're just one of the parallel sessions, you're given a huge time slot. It's almost 3 times what you'd get at an ordinary academic conference where you've got 15 minutes to talk and 5 minutes for questions. So you've got 45 minutes, and I really wanted to have at least 20 or 25 minutes of just discussion, and like you said. And so what I got from it was the thing that I get most out from this whole conference, just sharing stories with other teachers, getting ideas. I got an idea that I can try in my classroom. Literally, I'm going to try that idea tomorrow.
Yeah, what can you describe what that was?
Oh yeah. So Stuart told about this process that he does.
Stuart's another presenter here, right?
That's right. Who I think you watched his session first. So he basically gets his students to think back on a moment where they were successful at doing something. Can be any. It doesn't have to be language learning, and then they kind of talk about what made them motivated to achieve that success. How did they get that successful moment in their lives? And then they kind of backwards engineer their own motivation and deconstruct that narrative of a successful experience, and then try to take the lessons that they already know and apply them to their current learning situation. It's a brilliant idea. So I'm going to try that tomorrow with my class. And lots of other books to read. Lots of stuff came from the feedback session. It was really good.
The focus of your session was more on your own personal outside the classroom experiences and how it affected your class.
Yes, that's right. So that's the theme of this. As Mike Ellis, who opened the conference, said, at this conference people come and tell stories about themselves, and that's the kind of focus that he said we're very student-centered in our teaching, but yet you can't deny that the teacher has a very central role as well. And so this conference is really what Mike Ellis said is, this conference is about switching the spotlight round onto the teacher for once. And so this is why people talk about themselves a lot. But some people do that without always making it quite clear how it relates to their teaching. So I think that's the only danger. It needs to connect to teaching. So I tried to, and I also tried not to dominate my session, and that's why I wanted lots of conversations with the people in there, and turn it into a kind of workshop really, or discussion.
Rob sat down with some other presenters at the conference and found out more about them and their work.
Okay, my name is Monika Szirmai. I'm from Hungary, and I came to Japan in 1995, and I've been teaching at university level in Japan since then.
Okay, nice. And so your presentation was about how you were hired as a native speaker teacher, despite having started to learn English. I think you said at 16.
Yes.
Yeah. So could you sort of very briefly explain how you moved from being sort of a late beginning language learner to being hired as a native speaker of that language?
Okay. Well, life is a chain of unexpected events. So after finishing university in Hungary, I started teaching, of course, at different high schools. But already as a university student, we tried to go to all kinds of events, anything where people could learn, or we could learn English or French, because I majored in English and French. And after I started teaching, I had the same policy. So whenever there was an occasion to do something interesting and learn and get paid for that, then I was there. So I took part for 3 years in an international language camp in the summer, and that was for 3 weeks. And I went to in-service trainings and I got some scholarships. So I accidentally saw a job advertisement. I applied for that, and I knew that if I got to the interview, then I would have the job. Usually the problem is that if they look at your CV and they can see that you're not a native speaker, then it goes straight to the rubbish bin. So, and that's what happened. I got the interview and I got the job.
Right. What do you think they meant by a native speaker?
Well, somebody who was born and brought up in an English language, English-speaking country. The problem is that being a native speaker is different from being a teacher, because I remember when in the town I was teaching French at the time, of course, Hungarian teachers of English, they taught students outside of school as well, until an out-of-job printer from Newcastle came to the town, and he became the English teacher without any, qualifications or anything. Just the fact that he came from Britain and he had a funny pronunciation was enough to become the English teacher in that town. So, being a native speaker means being born and brought up somewhere.
Not really connected to proficiency or ability to teach or anything.
No, not
that.
Really. No.
Yeah. Why do you think that's got such a big hold in Japan? The idea of the native speaker as opposed to the teacher, the proficient teacher.
Because that's the real thing, right? Maybe they judge other non-native speakers by their standards. They can't speak English. Very few. Well, it's not true anymore, but I've met some Japanese teachers of English whose English was absolutely amazing.
Right.
It was a pleasure to listen to them. The pronunciation was perfect. The humor was excellent. That was a teacher from Osaka.
Right.
So there are many teachers, but that was university level. I doubt that you can... the first shock... I had a shock when I was in America, and I was invited to an event which was for Japanese high school teachers of English. We couldn't talk to each other in English.
Right.
And I just couldn't believe it. I was a high school teacher myself. So they don't want non-native speakers because they think that non-native speakers' level is the same as theirs.
Right. I see. It's interesting. And finally, you mentioned about passive students, and you said that people kind of think of Japan as being unique in having passive students, but you also said in Hungary that students have the same kind of characteristics. Do you think that's something that's true the world over?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Probably not. It depends on individuality as well. It depends on the culture of the school. It depends on teaching methods. It depends on a lot of things. I don't think it necessarily has to be true, but probably the teaching traditions or the learning traditions of these countries, like in Hungary as well, it was like that.
Right. Okay. And finally, what advice would you give to someone who's kind of in your position, thinking of applying for jobs that have these native speaker requirements?
Well, I think they should have a native-like pronunciation, first of all. So, and they should maybe anticipate what kind of questions there might be during the interview. Also, maybe they should learn a lot about the culture, what is expected from them. To be honest, a lot of these were native speakers, but even if you go to a different culture, you might realize that you can't put up with it. So after a year or two, you just flee the country.
Right.
And that's what happened to some of my colleagues. They just couldn't put up with it. So you have to, if you invest a lot of energy and a lot of money to go to a country, and then you realize it's not for you, then it was all in vain. So maybe you should get as much information as possible about the teaching situation, the expectations, the culture, whether you have to speak all the time the language of the country.
So My name is Tats Nagasaka, and everybody knows me by my Catholic Christian name, Paul.
Right.
Yeah. Then today's presentation was about teacher self-concept. How we look at ourselves and what do we think we are doing.
Right.
Yeah. Educator, for example, educator, or role model or motivator, something like that. And the facilitator is one word, very evocative.
Yes, kind of a buzzword, facilitator.
Kind of covers everything.
Yes, yeah.
But and at the same time, our self concept or view are changing. Yeah. Especially according to the age.
Right.
Yeah. It's not a super number, but 40. Around 40 is a big gap between the two generations. And next generation is more of a research and TESOL oriented. The older generation is more of what should I say? Dying species. Yeah, but the dying species look at themselves as a facilitator and more of pedagogy oriented. Yeah. So they, including me, tend to try concentrate on education.
Right.
Yeah. Younger generations are eager to aspiring their future, of course. They need more decorations on their CVs.
Right.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's changing of the educational system. Yeah. Back in 1980s and 90s, when I was a college student, there was no TESOL-oriented courses for future teachers.
Right.
Yeah. TESOL or EFL are practically unknown words for the future teachers. Yeah. But now the TESOL, EFL, and applied linguistics, even a PhD is must for the college educators.
Right.
Yeah.
So how has your career changed? So you split it into these two different groups, pre-40s and, and post-40s.
Just changing the system of education is one thing, but also the job market is changing.
Right.
The job market is changing, and even for the part-time teaching position, some colleges require PhD. It's ridiculously inflating.
Right.
But of course, not only bad side. TESOL, EFL, these teaching scheme, teaching techniques, and improving day by day.
Right.
The more information, more resources, more incentive on teaching, it's okay. But at the same time, it's the quality of the education is going down. Now the many colleges are introducing the basic cross-facultural training courses, which includes obviously English education. Those the contents of those basic college education is something they did in high school or even junior high school back in 1970s and 80s.
Do you think so? If 40 is kind of a critical turning point, is there another critical turning point after that, at an even later age? Do you think?
Personally speaking, I don't think there is no big gap after once you reach 40.
Right.
Yeah, 40 is the kind of a turning point for everybody's lifespan. Right? Yeah, getting family, having child.
Right.
getting married or something like that. You have to seriously think about your working style in terms with the social point of view.
Right. Yeah. So after 40, everything changes, but then it's pretty stable, you say.
Yeah, the people tend to get safer road.
Yes.
Yeah. Not the restaurant.
I spoke to fellow TEFLologist Matt about his presentation on integrating a deaf student into the EFL class and about his story so far. So, your presentation, can you tell us, first of all, what it was about?
Yeah, so this semester I've been teaching a deaf student with hearing impairments, and yeah, basically my presentation today was all about my. I told a narrative throughout this semester, told through my a journal that I'm keeping after each class, and I kind of picked out kind of critical instance about my experiences teaching my deaf student, and I kind of told a story basically.
Okay. And how do you think it went?
What do you mean, my teaching or the presentation?
The presentation.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, it went all right. There was only like 5 people there, one of which was you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there were a couple of people that I'd never met before, and everyone had nice questions and nice comments to say. And actually, we were down to present for 45 minutes, and my talk almost went up to 40 minutes, and I was quite surprised when I looked at the time that it had flown by pretty much. But yeah, I mean, it was quite broken up. There were people asking questions during the talk anyway, but yeah, it was fun. It was nice actually. It was really hot actually.
Yeah.
Not the talk, but my actual temperature.
So it was a Teacher Journeys Conference. Obviously, your journey was about teaching this blind student what you've learned from it. Could you trace sort of the key moments in that journey?
Well, I mean, there's been like a few critical instances. For example, getting used to working with the note takers, establishing like a way of doing things with them, like what needs to be transcribed, what shouldn't be written down, and a way of writing stuff down, writing down exactly what they hear people say. I should mention that I teach on an English discussion course, so the note takers are not transcribing, they're just writing down what the other discussion participants are saying to each other. Yeah, so getting used to the note takers, also getting used to the other learners as well, because for them it's the first time to maybe interact with a deaf person. And actually, the one thing I said to you before, the one thing I didn't really talk about today was the student herself. Right. Because she hasn't really caused any or posed any issues for me. Okay. It's been everything else in the class around her that's been the issue. Yeah.
So what's changed in your classroom due to having a deaf student in there?
So it's made me realise the amount of things that I don't really need to say. Right. It's made me reduce all of my redundant teacher talk, and it's thrown up a few things that I hadn't expected. Like I script everything that I say to her, and it's basically made me reevaluate. Like sometimes the things that I write down to say, I don't say it as it's been written, and I can't understand why that's happened. Right. And it might just be through a case of not rehearsing it, but I don't know why it happens, and obviously that causes problems for everyone. It causes problems for the note takers and the other students, basically. Yeah.
So you're working on a discussion course at a university. There's quite a lot of support available. Yeah. Is there any advice you could give to a teacher in other circumstances, say in a private language school, if they had to teach a deaf student?
Well, I think good advice that you told me when you were teaching a blind student that we talked about on this podcast before is the best person to teach you or tell you about how to teach them is the student themselves. So that's one piece of advice. Things take time, things are going to be messy, you might have to make adaptations, but try to keep it as inclusive as possible, maybe. Yeah, I guess.
and Rob was also presenting at the conference alongside Richard Pinter. We don't need introductions.
No.
So you were doing a presentation as well today.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about and how did it go?
Well, it was about the idea of presumed competency. So that's something that I came up with independently, but then through Googling found out that it's actually a term that's used in the teaching of, I think, autistic children. So, but it's not about that. It's the idea is that these are things that teachers are assumed to be competent to teach on the basis of their nationality or their speakerhood, whether or not they're actually trained or whether they have any knowledge in the subject.
Okay.
And the example that I was giving for this was teaching a course on poetry. So I teach at a university, and I was asked to teach for the last 2 years a content course on English poetry. And I've got no training in poetry, no qualifications in poetry, but I was asked to teach a university level course on poetry. I asked why, and they said, well, the Ministry of Education has suggested that foreigners shouldn't just teach conversation, which is weird because I wasn't teaching conversation in any of the other classes. I don't know why they assumed that. So we thought about things that you could do, and we thought, hey, poetry. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of strange because, like in our department we teach English education, we teach linguistics, we teach things that I actually am trained in. But instead I was asked to teach poetry and also British culture, which again, I'm British, but I left Britain at 22.
That's the presumption.
Right, exactly.
You can do it.
Yes,
right.
yeah. So the presumption is that as a British, native speaker, so-called, I am in some way more culturally, authentically capable of doing these things, even though I'm actually not trained in them at all. So that was the topic of the presentation.
Okay. And how was it received?
Well, I should point out this was a co-presentation with Richard Pinter, who I think.
We've interviewed.
Yeah, he's on here as well. Yeah. And it went very well. Yeah, we're actually trying to investigate this. It's kind of a hypothesis at the moment. So we spoke for like half the time, and then the second half we chatted to the people in the audience and asked if they had any similar experiences, and it turned out some of them did. So some of the people were talking about how times they'd been asked to comment on things or teach things that were way beyond their cultural sphere, but which they were just assumed to be able to talk about because they were foreign, basically.
I see. Okay.
So I think overall, I think the whole conference has been really interesting, hearing all of the different stories. I think ours was a bit less of a story. There was a story in there, but we were thinking more about this theoretical idea of presumed competencies. But I think in hearing other people's stories has been a very valuable way to spend a conference, rather than looking at a lot of statistics, which is what the conferences normally are over here. Yeah. So it's been good. Thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'd like to thank Mike Ellis and all of the presenters from the EFL Teacher Journeys Conference, both for an excellent conference and for agreeing to be interviewed for this podcast. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. We also have a Facebook page, that's Facebook, the Teflology Podcast, and you can visit our website, teflology-podcast.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.